In this video, Dr. Jordan Peterson explains subjective and objective perceptions.
I was talking to one of my students yesterday. He had a pretty smart thing to say about images. We were talking about deep images, you know, the sorts that you might see in a really high quality museum. So maybe they're, I don't know, 15th century or 16th century Renaissance masterpieces. They're inexhaustible to some degree, which is why they're in museums and people go look at them, you know, decade after decade. And it's partly because every time you look at them, you're different. You go in 1 week, you look at it, you see something. You go in the next week, you look at it, you see something else. Well, it's partly because you're bringing something entirely different to the situation. And the image is complicated enough to allow it to reflect something new to you, depending on the stance you take in relationship to it. And lots of things are like that. Lots of things are like that. A book you read when you were 16 is going to be an entirely different book when you read it when you're 35. You say, well, the book's the same. It's like, it depends on how you define the book, because it isn't even obvious where the book is exactly. Well, it's on my shelf in the library. It's like, no, that's a chunk of paper that's on your shelf in the library. Where exactly the book is, that's a much more difficult question to consider. So it depends on how you define the book. So without a subject, nothing at all would exist to confront objects and to imagine them as such. True, this implies that every object, everything objective, in being merely objectified by the subject is the most subjective thing possible. Well, you also know this again when you're in an argument with someone. It's you. No, it's you. No, it's you. It's like, you don't know. Are you being biased? Are you looking at the situation incorrectly? The person you're arguing with is going to convince you that trying to convince you that it's your problem. You think, no, you made me angry. It's like, an interesting statement, you know, as if you could do that, but it does seem that way. You were being provocative. Well, you're just too sensitive. It's like, how are we going to settle that? Well, it's a continual argument, and that again has to do with the crazy entangled dynamic between subjective perception and objective perception. You need to narrow down your world. And what you're doing is narrowing it down from, let's say, an infinite set of possibilities to a finite set of manageable possibilities. And you do that a bunch of ways. Partly merely your senses aren't acute enough to detect everything. So pure stupidity, in some sense, stops you from being absolutely overwhelmed. You don't have eyes in the back of your head, for example, so you don't have to worry about all those things you're not looking at behind you. But then it's far more than that. You just can't handle that full complexity, so there's a continual narrowing process. And then you exist inside that narrowed reality. Like if I look at you like that, there's not a hell of a lot of difference between that and looking at you like that. Like I can't really see these people. I can tell they're people, that's all. I can see your face. I've got just about all of it right there. So that's a very narrow, and you know, you're moving your eyes around and inhabiting this constant narrow space. Well, what's that space? What does that space you inhabit consist of? Well, that's Dasein, that space that you inhabit. And so we could say it's something like this. You have implicit in that perception a sense of where you are and what you're doing right now. It's in the perception. And then in the perception as well is what you're aiming at, because you're not just sitting here passively, or you'd be asleep, or you'd be unconscious. You're sitting here doing nothing, you know, physically, but you have an aim in mind, and the aim is what you're pointing your eyes at. The aim is what's structuring your perceptions. The aim is what's revealing that part of the world that is being revealed to you. That's the revelation of the world. It also structures your emotions. It also primes your behaviors. So it's not a drive, it's not a goal, it's not a motivation. It's more than that. It's all of that at once. That's sort of what your personality is. But you see, the phenomenologists don't really think about personality. They think about the manifestation of your reality. It's not exactly your personality. It's that you're the center of a reality, and you constitute that reality. But all your elements of experience constitute that reality. And so it's something like, its simplest element is something like where you are, where you're going, and the embodied actions you undertake to relate those two things, which would include your eye movements, because of course, perception is an active phenomena. You are shaking your eyes back and forth unbelievably rapidly. Otherwise, if you can make your eyes stand still, which you can do with great concentration, everything will black out. because you have to move your eyes back and forth so that the light hits different cells, because the cells get exhausted and then they stop reporting. So you're just whipping your eyes back and forth in a micro way constantly, and as well as moving them around voluntarily and involuntarily. So even perception is a lot more like feeling things out with your fingers, even when you're using your ears or your eyes. It's very active. There's no passive perception. It's a motor act to perceive. And so that motor act is determined by your hierarchy of values. That's one way of looking at it. So another way of thinking about it, that's also how the past and the future are implicit in it. Your very active perception is determined by your entire value structure. So it's implicit inside of it. It's folded up inside of it. You can tell that too, because if something violates it, again, maybe an argument with someone, because it's good to think about people as the thing you interact with the most, as the canonical object, because they're so damn complicated and they get in the way all the time. And when someone gets in the way of what you're doing, it isn't obvious what they're interfering with. It might be the little micro routine that you're undertaking right now. Maybe you go home and you make a nice dinner and the person you're making it for is all rude about it.